pays a lot of attention to world events, particularly anything having to do with things that would affect our U.S. foreign policy. The mighty Lord Woodstone, who more commonly goes by the name Eric, but whatever. And apparently things are heating up with the Chiefs game over there.
Yeah. Chiefs. It sounds like the Chiefs just scored, so I'm happy. So yeah, go Chiefs.
Which tells you something about where Eric is hanging out at right now. Kansas somewhere. Kansas is big. It's long, desolate.
Not out where I am.
Hey, you grow a lot of corn and windmills.
That is true.
I have driven through the state.
Yes.
I was like, holy crap, do the windmills ever end?
Yeah, they don't.
Okay. And we've got Eric on because one of the things I noticed a few months back actually was, okay, this dude pays a lot of attention to what's going on with China in particular. Mm-hmm. And anyone who's talked to me at all about any sort of foreign policy stuff knows I'm a little concerned about China and have been for a while. Because, well, I have a memory. And one of the things I remember is, and this goes back quite a while ago. This goes back a long time ago, actually. It goes back about 20 years ago, maybe 19 specifically. And I remember it was an old Newsmax article back when Newsmax was just almost nobody knew what it was.
Yeah.
And they had a quote from Chinese admiral, I think. And they were asking him about, basically it was like, are you going to invade Taiwan anytime soon? He's like, nah, we're not going to have the capability to do that for about another 10 years. I was like, when somebody says something like that and provides a timetable, you take note. Yeah. And I noticed it was actually a little more than 10 years than that they rolled out their first carrier. Mm-hmm. Now, the first carrier, of course, as you know, let's face it, it's a joke.
Yeah.
It was literally a converted Russian cruise liner. I'm not exactly shaking in my boots over here. And the Taiwanese probably weren't either. But it shows them trying to move in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. But before we get into it, first, what Lord Woodstone? Why are you the Lord of Wood and Stone?
So it started off as something of a joke. If you're familiar with my account on Twitter, I've for a while got sucked into what we call the thread, and it was something Meerkat Yitz started back in early 2019, I think. And he posted, it was one of those face app things. It was, what would you look like as a girl? And so Gentleman Rascal, Andrew, started joking about how he was going to create a thread that was never going to die. A bunch of my friends got sucked up into it. I got sucked into it. We all started making joke names for it, because before that I was just going by my real name. And so I started going by that within it. People started coming and finding me as I was talking about geopolitics. When I was doing that, I started building sort of a Twitter brand around this joke nickname. And so I just kind of started running with it. And it really hit its stride back in 2019 during back when India and Pakistan were starting to go at it. And I started getting tapped into this OSINT network, this open source intelligence network that I first found before that when I was just paying attention to the Israel-Palestine conflicts. And so I started getting tapped into this open source intelligence network of people who were analyzing and aggregating just videos and news articles on Twitter and sitting there and talking about what it meant, making predictions going forward. And so I got really plugged into that network back during that flare up of fighting between India and Pakistan. And so it just kind of stuck with it. And I started making jokes with it and people started responding to them. And it was like, okay, I guess I'm stuck as Lord Woodstone now. And it's kind of become my foreign policy nom de plume.
Well, why not?
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, I remember that. That was all the rage for about 10 minutes. And actually that one I was actually just talking about that one at work not long ago. I was like, yeah, it's kind of weird. It all flared up for a little bit and then just kind of went away. Nothing actually happened.
Thankfully.
One of them tested a nuke, and then the other one was like, "Well, I've got one too. Look, I've got a bigger one."
Smiling
And,
Buddha. Smiling
Yeah.
Buddha. What a name for a nuclear test.
I mean, we had Fat Man and Little Boy. What do you want?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I mean, so it was really interesting. You had a little bit of this, shall we say, measuring contest going on between those two for a little bit, and then all of a sudden it just goes away. I can't help but wonder, were there some phone calls made? Behind the scenes. Behind the scenes where
the whole thing was being fought over a glacier that is the headwaters for the Indus River, and which also has a little bit of feed into the Ganges. So whatever was happening behind the scenes, they probably were able to get the water rights issue figured out, because that's what most of the conflicts that you're seeing between India and Pakistan right now is. It's water. Yeah. And it's the Sachin Glacier up in the Himalayas, because that's what feeds most of Pakistan's water. Because Pakistan is essentially just a giant river valley around the Indus River, and all of their water comes from this river, but it starts in India. And so control over those headwaters pretty much defines whether or not Pakistan is a country. And it's one of the reasons why they've been snuggling up to China the way that they have, is because they're hoping to start building up more trade so that they can find alternate sources of water, so that they're not as reliant on snow peaks and snow cap that's in Indian territory.
Well, I can't blame them for wanting to secure a solid water source, because
it's
kind of important. I was just thinking, I wonder if it was their own leaders who were just working on negotiations behind the scenes while they were directing their generals to display power, or if it was us or maybe China, or maybe both, who called them up and be like, guys, yeah, I know you like your new toys, but ours are way bigger and we have way more of them, so stop it.
It probably was a bit of both. I wouldn't be surprised if most of the NATO powers, and possibly even Russia and China, were involved behind the scenes, sitting there going, guys, you have enough guys. Pakistan alone has enough nukes to end the world. Pakistan alone has enough nukes to cause nuclear winter. Let's tone it down a bit. Let's step back away from the brink. Let's stop shooting at each other so much, and let's get back to the negotiating table so we can start working these things out.
Yeah, and in the case of us and Russia, we have enough nukes on one submarine to do that. So,
100 nuclear weapons.
You want to go? Let's go.
100 nuclear explosions on the surface of the Earth in a given year is enough to end all life on Earth.
Well, won't that just be fun?
Yeah, it's a sobering statistic when you think about it.
Yeah, especially when you consider, you can pack like a dozen of them on a missile,
and multiple independent range vehicles.
Yep, and I have, and I forget what the capacity of the average boomer is, but I'm pretty sure it's more than 10.
The average Ohio class can fit 10 Trident subs, Trident missiles, and they can get 4 MIRV warheads right now.
So there's 40 right there on one sub. Sub.
Yeah.
And we've got a few of those. So okay. But so to China. First, for those who don't know, a little bit of history. Why on earth would China even care about Taiwan?
So all goes back to the Chinese Civil War. So back around the time that Europe was killing each other during World War I, you had the Qing Dynasty falling apart. The Qing Dynasty had been weak for a generation at this point. The European powers had been carving out concessions for generations at this already. Shanghai was, for all intents and purposes, controlled by a conglomerate of France, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, and And Japan's own influence became a lot greater after they started modernizing. Japan went on a crash modernization course after Perry showed up, because they realized what was coming, and they didn't want to be prey. They wanted to be a predator, because they knew that was the only way that they were going to survive. So during World War I, Japan started taking away German concessions, and China started assuming full sovereignty over them. They got almost everything, actually, except for the German concession in Shanghai, which would ironically be very helpful for China during World War II. So the Qing Dynasty was considered weak. It was considered that they had lost what is known within Confucian philosophy as the mandate of heaven. So the mandate of heaven is this traditional philosophy that goes back to Mencius, who was a Confucian philosopher, and it says that that all of the nobility claims descent from the Jade Emperor, who is the father of the three sovereigns and the five emperors. And so the question was, if the first dynasty to rule China was divine, well, they just got overthrown. Who's going to be next? Well, Mencius wrote about what is known as the concept of the mandate of heaven. Namely, so long as a Chinese government is ruling well, ruling just, following Confucian principles, generally being what globally would be considered to be a just, good ruler, then they've got the mandate of heaven. But if they become corrupt, if they become avaricious, if they're declaring war unnecessarily, if they're being tyrannical to their own people, then the mandate has been removed, and it is time for a new power struggle to determine who has the mandate next. And that can only be determined by a clash of arms. So all throughout Chinese history, you've got a dynasty rising to power. They become corrupt. In some instances, hilariously so. If you ever get a chance, look up the meat forest and the wine lake. There is a Chinese empress who is still to this day vilified because of what she convinced the emperor to do. Then they fall apart. There's a civil war. All the claimants to the imperial throne struggle against each other until one becomes dominant and the others are forced to recognize them. And so the same thing had happened with the Qing Dynasty there in World War I. So you had Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the Republic of China, who had been the generalissimo, akin to a shogun or the head of a junta under the Qing Dynasty, who told the last Qing emperor, "Leave, you're done. The mandate of heaven has been removed. I'm claiming it for myself." And he managed to make enough deals with the various warlords who controlled the banner regions of China, that he was able to get a majority of the army under his control. And so with that, he was able to consolidate power, but he never really got sufficient legitimacy within the eyes of the people with the new republic he was trying to start. And it didn't help that he was trying to play both ends against each other, where he would be talking to the Soviet Union, which had just been created. He was talking to the West. He was talking to whoever he could get to send him advisors and military arms and political assistance so that he could try and create something solid that would last. And when Sun Yat-sen died, you had Chiang Kai-Shek, who took power. Chiang Kai-Shek, he started off more sympathetic to the communist ideals, but quickly started turning away from them because of some of the stuff he was seeing happening in the Soviet Union. And he started deciding he needed to be more of a moderate, more of a centrist, focused on what China needs, not focus on ideology for the moment. So the Soviet Union saw what was happening, and they started supporting an actual communist party in China. Young Mao Zedong eventually wound up getting involved in that, was a very early member of that movement. And so Chiang Kai-Shek started seeing some of the issues that were showing up. His own Kuomintang party was originally intended to be a Big Tent party. There were communists involved in it, and they started defecting to this new Chinese Communist Party. And Chiang Kai-Shek saw that as a threat to his power base. So he started trying to kick out the communists, including a rather bloody purge at one point, and started kicking off conflict and violence between some of the governing parties within the republic. However, at that moment, it looked like Chiang Kai-shek had it all under control. The Chinese Communist Party was the leader of these leftist movements, but none of them were really all that big at the time. The average Chinese person didn't really care about politics. They just wanted to have a full stomach. They just wanted to have safety and security, and they just wanted to be left alone as best possible. So for the most part, that was something that was just happening within the elites. It wasn't really affecting the average person. Then a railroad in Manchuria blew up in 1930 in the 1930s.
Okay.
And it was a false flag by the Japanese, trying to blame China for it. Japan had been more and more Manchuria. They already had control of Korea at this time. And so they started making incursions into China. Now, most of this you've probably heard in your history classes covering World War II. But the important part here is that Mao Zedong and his guys went and hid in the mountains, and Chiang Kai-shek got his National Resistance Army and marched against Japan. So while Mao Zedong and his buddies were hiding up in the mountains and occasionally trading opium for guns with the Imperial Japanese Army, Chiang Kai-shek was fighting them. And if you look at the casualty rates, the NRA suffered almost 300% casualties fighting this war. It was, it was the worst casualty rate of any force in World War II. And so when the war was over, when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and forced Japan to surrender and stopped the killing of a 250,000 Chinese a day, the KMT's forces were weak. They could not stand up on their own, and the CCP still had power. So Mao Zedong led his newly unified army out against the NRA. They fought a series of battles that took them all across China, losing. Would have a lot of pirate victories, but the KMT just did not have the men and material at this point to hold out. So they were forced to withdraw to Taiwan, which had actually been under Japanese control for several generations at this point. It had only recently been turned back over to China as a result of the treaties at the end of the instruments of unconditional surrender at the end of the war. And so Chiang Kai-shek led his forces there to Taiwan. And so in Taiwan, the rump state of the Republic of China was established. And the People's Republic of China just did not have the capacity to cross the Taiwan Strait, especially because at that time, the U.S. was already a strong ally of Chiang Kai-shek, saw the threat that the CCP posed, and we were not going to, and we were going to do everything we could to make sure that they couldn't cross the Black Ditch. So you had the creation of two governments that still claim to be the legitimate government of all of China, one in Taipei, one in Beijing. And so it's essentially, for all intents and purposes, that civil war has never ended. And it can't end.
Technically speaking, yeah.
Yeah. And it can't end because China, the only outcome that Beijing will allow is the subjugation of Taiwan. If Taiwan makes any changes to their constitution right now to renounce their claims to any part of China and declare themselves to just be the government of Taiwan, China will invade. If they are recognized by too many people, China will invade. And so there's this stalemate and status quo within the government of Taiwan where they have to keep claiming Beijing, but Beijing also has to keep claiming Taiwan because they've built up this national mythology around the reunification, and that China can only truly be great when all of China is reunited.
Okay. So that's convoluted.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets worse if you try reading Xi Jinping thought.
I'm sure.
It's a nightmare.
Now, one thing I'm curious about, or one of my little takeaways from that is, Taiwan hasn't been part of China in any sense for very long.
No,
not really, because one of the arguments that people will use to say, why should we care if China wants to reclaim something that is historically theirs? It's not really that much history of it being part of China.
Yeah. Taiwan was even when Taiwan was controlled by China before Japan took it away,
Mm-hmm.
it was primarily most of the people who were living there weren't Han Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
They were the native population who'd been living there since they first arrived on the island millennia ago, and China only started establishing a presence there maybe 2-3 generations before Japan took it away from them, and even then, it was never that large of a presence. And so the Han Chinese presence on Taiwan didn't
Mm-hmm.
really grow that to be significant until Chiang Kai-Shek led his guys into exile and set up the government in Taipei.
Okay, so there you go.
Mm-hmm.
They're historically part of China thing. That's bunk.
Yeah.
Well, that's good because I also don't overly care too much about that as an argument anyway.
Yeah.
There are those who do. I'm not swayed overly much by it because I mean you can take that same logic and extend it to any number of different things.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there's a lot of revisionist arguments you can make if you're making an argument on the basis of, hey, we've always lived here.
Yeah,
I mean, by that argument, Spain should be part of Turkey.
And the Cherokee should go and reclaim Georgia.
Yeah.
Just as an example, the whole the historically part of things like.
It's always fun though when I encounter that argument from the same tankies who are sitting there and saying that that the Palestinians should have control of all of Palestinians should have control of all of Israel, despite the fact that the Israelis have just as valid of a historical claim to that area.
Well, yeah, and especially if we're going into history, a Palestinian is just an Arab who lives within the borders of Israel. That's what a Palestinian is.
Interestingly, if you go back far enough, there's a very good chance that the Palestinian people may actually originally be Italian.
That's cool.
The Sea Peoples and the Paliset, it's believed that the Paliset, we know that the Paliset were defeated when they tried to invade Egypt and were resettled in that area. Mm-hmm. So it's the Paliset, the Philistines, and then eventually the Palestinians. And so, yeah, there's still some genetic testing that needs to be done, but there is a linguistic connection there that has been noted going back to the Bronze Age collapse.
So they may be Arab Italian mutts.
It's far enough back that at this point their genetics may be entirely replaced. But yeah, that too. But it's an interesting historical fact.
yeah. As a historical curiosity, it's interesting. But as a thing that matters, things that matters in the present day, who cares?
After a full saeculum has gone by, after a full generation has gone by, historical claims tend to be invalidated. If you've had a full generation living there and dying there, it kind of stops being a valid argument.
Yeah, and as Varric mentions in the chat, basically every European war is that used to be mine.
Accurate, yes.
Yeah, that's more or less right, and they're all not wrong. That probably did used to be yours, or your granddaddy's, or your great granddaddy's. But before that, it was the otother guys. Yeah. And before that, literally no one knows.
Yeah. Go back far enough, it all gets lost into myth and folklore.
Yeah, it's like if you want to start playing that game, well, I guess you should just hand over the entire island of Britain to the Welsh, because
hey, they're the actual. That sounds good to me.
I mean, they're the actual Britons.
Yeah, they're Welsh of the originals. Yep.
Yeah. It kind of blew me away when I was reading it. I'm like, oh, Welsh. That's the Anglo-Saxon word for foreigner, which they named the natives that they were kicking out of their own territory. That's awesome. Good job,
guys.
That
a lot. You find that a lot in history. Lot in history.
Yep. It was like, we have to delegitimize their claim somehow. They don't belong here because they're foreigners. But didn't they live here before? Well, until we showed up. Yeah, but I guess we're done with that.
Yep.
You to that corner of the island. Maybe we'll come for you. Maybe we won't.
Yeah, that's fairly accurate.
Yeah, it's amazing though, like the weird little things you pick up when you pick a subject and just start reading on and around it, because I picked that up when I was very big into Arthurian legend.
Mhm.
So I started reading about the legend, the possible things that it was based on, and everything. And before you know it, you're getting to the whole backstory of Europe before there was Rome. It's like, oh, that's fun.
And that is a fascinating subject.
Oh yes,
I've recently found some great stuff by History Time, where they were talking about some of the time periods that's of that era. And then Dan Davis has a great YouTube channel where he talks about where he's been doing a lot of Bronze Age and early Iron Age history,
Oh, cool.
connected to his Gods of Bronze fantasy trilogy, and it is fantastic stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, now getting back to the other side of the world, back over to China. Okay, so
Mhm.
we know why China kind of cares about
Mhm.
Taiwan. For one, that's where their political opposition fled.
Mhm.
I mean, probably the biggest political reason they care.
Oh yeah.
But there are, of course, also, I'm sure, strategic reasons why they care about Taiwan.
So Taiwan is the centerpiece of what is known as the First Island Chain. And the First Island Chain starts with the Kuril Islands up in Russia and then runs all the way down Japan, the Senkakus, Taiwan, down into the Philippines, and then down towards Indonesia and Malaysia. And it is this natural barrier that prevents that cuts off the South and East China Seas and the Sea of Japan from the rest of the Pacific. If so long as Taiwan is in hostile hands, China does not have unfettered access to the Pacific. And they've read Alfred Thayer Mann's book. They know that sea power is one of the determining factors in history. Most of their customers are on the other side of the Pacific. They know that they need unfettered access to the Pacific. On top of that, 80% of all oil for China comes through the Strait of Malacca in Indonesia. That's a huge choke point. I don't know if you've ever seen a shipping map for that area. The shipping lane gets so dense that ships that would normally never see each other on the ocean, even if they're on the same shipping lane, will be close to each other, like close enough that you can shout and talk to people on the other ship as you're crossing. Yes. And it's all right there next to Singapore. It is one of the key strategic choke points on the entire planet. And 80% of all Chinese oil flows from Iran and from the Arab states through the Strait of Malacca. And if China is going to secure that pipeline, they have to be able to get out into the Pacific. They need to know that they're not going to have an unsinkable aircraft carrier that is hostile to them sitting just 100 kilometers off of their coast. So they don't have a choice if they want to be the global power that they want to be, but to take Taiwan. Taiwan is their greatest strategic stumbling block in that regard. And it's one of the reasons why Xi Jinping talks about how China cannot be a great power, the great power it is meant to be, until they take Taiwan. So long as Taiwan is hostile to them, there is no way for them to project power into the rest of the world. And so they have to take Taiwan in order to attain their global ambitions.
Now, of course, I mean, honestly, if I was them, I'd be telling them, you don't actually have to sink a carrier. You just have to render it useless, which is way easier. Not easy. It's still a suicide mission, but it can be done.
Yeah. But Taiwan, because of how mountainous it is, also presents a number of challenges. There are very, very limited number of landing beaches that you can use. They're heavily concentrated up on the northeast, facing Japan. In fact, some of the Senkakus that China and Japan have been clashing over are within visual distance of Taiwan, to give you an idea of how close that is. And then some of them are down on the southwest corner. But the vast majority of them are up there on the northeast, within visual distance of Japan's overseas territories. And it's places where Japan has started arming. Actually, they've started putting in anti-shipping batteries and anti-aircraft batteries up there because they recognize the threat that China that has unfettered access to the Pacific presents to them. They've actually recently redefined Article 9 to include a threat to Taiwan as a threat to Japan itself.
No kidding. That's interesting.
Yeah. because if China gets out into the Pacific and say South Korea and North Korea go at it again, big time, and it's the big one that we've all been fearing, Japan is going to come to South Korea's aid.
Of course.
But if China has unfettered access to the Pacific, any aid from the United States will have to fight to get here, just like during the Battle of the Atlantic. And so China wants that fettered access to the Pacific so that they can challenge those, so that they can protect their buffer state in North Korea. And
and I've long figured that North Korea was basically just on China's leash.
For all intents and purposes, it is. One of China's biggest fears is the North Korean government collapsing, and then all of those folks in Pyongyang streaming across the Yalu River. Chiefs just scored. Streaming across the Yalu River into China, and China cannot absorb those people. Not in that number. And so that's a huge concern for them, is making sure that North Korea stays where it is, that North Korea is strong enough that it won't collapse, and to make sure that South Korea can't come in, annex it, reunify that way, and then they'll have American troops on the Yalu River. So that's one of their concerns. On the point about just taking out and neutralizing the aircraft carrier, Taiwan is, much like Japan, essentially a volcanic seamount. So extended long one, but it is essentially just a volcanic seamount. And so for all intents and purposes, the Taiwanese people live along the coastal plains with most of it being mountainous ridges. It's why if you look at that map that I've got pinned to my pinned on my Twitter account, you see that all of the first level subdivisions in Taiwan meet in the center and then extend outwards. They're following those mountains down to the coast. So Taiwan has taken strong advantage of that, and they've got underground aircraft bays all along the Pacific side of Taiwan with runways that are going out from these bays so that they can launch their fighters essentially from within the mountains. North Korea does something very similar. I think it might be where they got the idea from. And so they can launch their fighters out over the Pacific, come up over the top of the mountains, and sortie and skirmish with PLA fighters. And on top of that, Taiwan has better aircraft. The F-1s, and then their domestic one, the F-1CK Qing Kuo, is essentially a 2-engine version of the F-16 F-16.
No kidding.
Yes. They wanted to import a bunch of F-16s. There was a sufficient number of people in Congress who were saying, no, this could start war with China. We don't want to risk it, but we can export parts. And so it's essentially an F-16 with 2 native designed jet engines on it. And it is interesting. And it is about on par with the PLA aircraft of that time period. Modern PLA aircraft tend to be a little bit better than those, but we're also rapidly helping China upgrade the F-16, F-16s to the F-16 Viper. I've more than once made a joke about how we need to find somebody named Adama to take control.
Please, yes, please, right? That would be amazing.
Yeah. Yes,
and right. we can just rename Taiwan Galactica, and that would be fantastic. Yes. That would be great.
Yes, codename Galactica.
Just go with me on this, guys. Come on.
Right. It should be. I have joked more than once that Taiwan's official designation and military plans should be Galactica, just as their call sign and nickname.
I think that would be amazing. We need that. This needs to happen. And yes, if there's anyone at all with a name similar to Adama on that island, they need to be put in charge.
Oh, exactly. They need to be in charge of their air wing. But that mountainous terrain also it plays an interesting effect with the landing beaches, because all of those landing beaches are surrounded by cliffs and mountains. And so Taiwan has been installing both tube and rocket artillery batteries along those, sighted in on the beaches. So any attempt to land on those beaches is going to be a nightmare.
Bloodbath.
It's going to be, think D-Day.
Yeah.
Times 5.
Actually, I was thinking of the Guns of Navarone.
Another good example, yes. Guns of Navarone would be another good example of what they'd be looking at.
First, you've got to get to the beach, and then if you get there, well, is that really a good thing?
Yeah, once you get there, it's Gallipoli. So, and it's one of the reasons why. Oops, sorry about that. It's one of the reasons why I think that China is going to act when I think they're going to act. The Republic of China armed forces are sufficiently strong that if China were to try and invade right now with just their active duty troops, they would have to send every single one of their active duty personnel to Taiwan today. The Taiwanese ground forces they're not as well trained as we'd like. There have been a lot of budget issues. The KMT, back when they were the ruling party, didn't want to spend too much money on training and arming their soldiers because they were worried that China would take the wrong message and may do a preemptive invasion as a result. So they tried to downplay military resistance and focus on just trying to tie it all up in questions of, okay, well, let's say if we do reunify, who's going to be in charge? How much autonomy are we going to have? And just we're buying time. Well, it turns out that they were buying time for China as well. And so when Tsai Ing-wen took power along with the DPP, she's made a much bigger priority of military spending, of training, and even has brought in U.S. Army Special Forces personnel to help train with guerrilla warfare style combat training. Something that for a long time, China said that if we were to station military forces on Taiwan, would spark an imminent invasion. And then all of a sudden, it was announced that we'd had a full A team of U.S. Army Special Forces sitting there helping train them for about a year. And everyone was like, when did that happen? And that was only recently revealed about a month ago. So that was an interesting revelation.
Now, you mentioned us, working with Taiwan to train them. That brought to my mind a little thing that came up. Gosh, what was it? A year or so ago now?
Mm-hmm.
That China had been training in Canada.
Yeah.
To learn some winter operations.
Yeah.
And also Canada was training. Did they actually train, or were they just planning on it and then it got scuttled because it got revealed? Or like Canada was going to train over in China.
I don't know whether or not Canada ever actually did the reciprocal, but yeah, China definitely had troops in Canada at their modern warfare training school. One of the best mountain warfare training schools on the planet, actually. We like to give Canada grief for their politics, but their military is no joke. The Canadian Armed Forces are top tier. They're world class, and their mountain infantry units are right up there with India's in terms of having being the best in the world. It's class of the world right there, up there in Canada, and it's why China was sending their troops to the Canadian mountain training facilities, because they were training them for Tibet to fight against India.
Which, of course, Tibet, mountains, snow, cold, not something you normally associate with China. So
no, but yeah, it's some of the harshest environments on the planet, and China's facing 10 full mountain infantry divisions out of India when that war eventually kicks off. And India's got another special force unit that is just Tibetans. It's a division-sized force of Tibetan exiles who have been trained specifically so that one day they can cross the Himalayas and free Tibet.
So they'll have a little bit of a stake in that.
And it's something that Xi Jinping knows is probably going to happen when he tries to go across the Black Ditch to take Taiwan, is that he's going to have to worry about keeping troops in place in Tibet, because India has already started hinting that they consider an attack on Taiwan to be a threat to them as well. Because if China is able to get out into the Pacific and project power, they're going to start taking advantage of the port that they've got in Sri Lanka, and they're going to start putting naval ships there to protect their supply of oil. They're also going to be doing more to help out Pakistan and build up Pakistan. And Pakistan and India are traditional rivals and enemies.
Now, one of the things I'm gathering out of this is obviously tangled web. as
Oh
such
yeah.
things often are. But what I'm seeing is, regardless of how we would respond to China
Mhm.
attempting to invade Taiwan,
Mhm.
whether we do sanctions, whether we just, park a carrier battle group in the area, or if we just flat out say, no, it's not happening, and we're not just going to park the carrier battle group, they're deploying, and you're toast. Uh, no matter what we do, it's entirely possible. Actually, anything we do short of that last option, to be perfectly frank, could wind up leading to World War III regardless.
Yeah.
The
If we
the
can.
the, the flat out smack them down thing could actually stop it, because they'd be like, it's the juice ain't worth the squeeze on this.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the likelihood of that is.
I am. I have been studying China since I was in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
I got a copy of A Treatise on Unrestricted Warfare and got freaked out by it. And I spent most of my life studying China and originally wanted to be an intelligence officer in the military.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't make it for medical health reasons, but I never stopped paying attention to China. I never stopped focusing on them. And I am convinced, based off of years of study of China at this point, that the only way to stop China from kicking off World War III is to prevent them from taking Taiwan. Because if they take Taiwan, they've got access to the Pacific, and they will act accordingly. And it will bring the US and China into a greater conflict. Whereas if we can stop them at Taiwan, it's going to cause all of the domestic political disputes that I'm fully convinced are driving China towards a war, towards an attempted invasion in October,
Mm-hmm.
will come and split wide open. In March of 2023, Xi Jinping is up for his third term as president, and if he is able to secure that, World War III happens. If we can stop him from doing so, China tears itself apart. If we go hands off, they likely go more Confucian rather than the legalism angle they've been going politically, and China calms down. We most likely get a much more benevolent government in Beijing as a result, and we're able to have China that is a partner that we can work with going forward. And that's one of the things I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see a peaceful, truly democratic China that we can be allies with. They've got issues that we can help with. They are a great economic power, especially as they start becoming prosperous. And it would be to the entire world's benefit to have a China that is free, democratic, and an ally.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to stop them. We have to stop Xi Jinping, and we have to stop Xi Jinping from being able to essentially do what dictators throughout history have done and start making imperialist land grabs. And the best way we can do that is to stop them at Taiwan.
And of course, one of the things that I know, one of the little domestic things that is probably helping drive this is a result of their one-child policy.
Oh yeah.
The fact that they have so many more single young men than they do single young women. And I know that's had other issues as well. I've read that there have been a lot of women getting kidnapped from neighboring countries and brought in to basically be forced.
There is
brides.
a human trafficking problem out of North Korea into China, providing brides for poor rural farmers who can't afford to buy a house and secure a bride that way. And so they'll buy Chinese North Korean refugees and keep them as a bride. And for a sufficient number of those North Korean refugees, even life as a slave bride to a Chinese peasant is a sufficient step up that they're like, I can handle this. I can deal with this. I can make this work. And but so
even with, shall we say, importing,
a lot it's still not enough.
It's still not nearly enough. So you have to channel all that testosterone somewhere, or that testosterone will get channeled in a place you don't want. And I imagine that's got to be contributing to some of the domestic issues you've hinted at.
Oh yeah, The Economist. This is tangentially related in terms of the same outcome, but The Economist did a study in I think it was 2017 that looked at polygamous nations and found that polygamous nations had some of the worst infighting and civil unrest for that very same reason. You've got all these bare branches who are young men who've got no hope for a future, no hope for a progeny, no hope for a better position, and
Because
so they have to
all the well-to-do dudes are sucking up all the
exactly.
yeah.
And China is seeing that problem as well. The uber rich tend to have harems. They've got second, third, and fourth wives. And you'll see CCP party members sitting there at conferences, and they'll be sitting there comparing texts from their mistresses, complaining about not getting the latest designer bags from Italy, and sitting there complaining about how their second and third wives are constantly henpecking them and demanding rich and fancy stuff. And they're acting like, oh, woe is me, I've got all these problems, but they're bragging about it. And it's something that filters out to the general populace, and the general populace is seeing this, and it's helping to drive some of this problem, because that gender imbalance becomes so much worse when you have somebody like, I'm blanking on his name, but China recently executed the most corrupt man in their history. He had an entire village that was just his harem. Every single house in the village was home to one of his 100 mistresses. Yeah.
Wow. Did he just like, you know what? We haven't had a Solomon in a while.
Apparently, he was the richest private individual in all of China. He couldn't even put his money in put his brownie in the bank because there was so much of it. When the police raided his house, he had literal pallets of shrink wrap cash just sitting in his house from all the bribe money that he'd been taking, and which he was using to support these 100 mistresses.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it exacerbates that only child problem. And like you said, most of them are little emperors, is what they're called. And they're also going to have to be the ones to financially support their families. Under traditional Confucian concepts of jiao, or filial piety, it is the responsibility of the working age men to take care of not just their parents and grandparents, but their in-laws as well, parents and grandparents both. So you've got one, maybe two people working to support 6 or more, plus their kid. Wow. And the average Chinese worker is making less than half what the average American worker is making.
Oh, that's just great.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is there's going to be a lot of people who are, there's more and more people that are probably pissed and a little dissatisfied with the way that the People's Republic has distributed its resources.
Oh, yeah.
And
we're already seeing a manifestation of that with what's known as the Line Flat movement, where you've got young men who are sitting there saying, no, I'm not going to work this from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and 6 days a week and then go home and have one day off. I'm going to do the bare minimum to keep myself alive. And I'm going to play video games the rest of the time, or I'm just going to hang out with my buddies, and I'm not even going to bother looking for a spouse, because you have to buy a house to have a spouse. And so there's no point in that. So I'm just going to do the bare minimum to get by. And that's it. Nothing more. And it's causing all kinds of social issues.
Now, is this part of why you suggest that if Xi Jinping doesn't make it past March 2023, you're like, his replacements are likely to be more moderate because they see this going on? Or
I don't think his replacements are, if the CCP is torn apart by a failure to take Taiwan, his replacement will be more moderate. If, however, he gets elected out, then it's going to be Jiang Zemin and his faction again. Jiang Zemin is the one, was the successor to Deng Xiaoping. He's the one who started up the persecution of Falun Gong. He's the one who started the international black market organ trade from Falun Gong practitioners. He's the one who set up an international... So he's not a good guy. Oh, no. I hesitate to say he's worse, so much as he's equally bad in a different way.
Gotcha.
And he was the architect of, they call it state capitalism, but it's really fascism, which has enabled China to rise up to become the powerhouse that it is. And he's the one who turned the Chinese Students and Scholars Association the Confucius Institutes, and all the other Chinese overseas influence organizations into actual espionage agencies, specifically so that they could go work with 610 office to hunt down Falun Gong practitioners overseas and try and coerce them to come back to China for organ harvesting. So Jiang Zemin and his cronies are just as bad, but in a horrifically different way.
Gotcha. Okay, so Xi's replacement may not be all that great.
No.
We might get, even if he gets replaced, we might wind up with World War III.
I don't think that if he gets replaced in 2023 in March at the conference, I think we'd be less likely to have World War III, simply because if that happens, Jiang Zemin has always been much more go softly. His guys have been very critical of the wolf warrior diplomacy that Xi Jinping has been pursuing, has said that it's a negative for China, that it's harming China's economic growth. And we've seen this from some of Jiang Zemin's partisans, even within Xi's cabinet.
He would be more likely to just continue to be a brutal dictator, but within the boundaries of China.
It would be more of a return to what we saw with Hu Jintao before Xi Jinping took power, where it's, we'll be a brutal dictator here. You'll leave us alone because we're going to be making cheap stuff for you, and we'll both get rich as a result. So we're less likely to see military conflict if Jiang Zemin takes power, if one of his cronies takes power and starts literally liquidating some of Xi Jinping's supporters.
That said, especially if they're the guys that got the Confucius, that made the Confucius Institutes more active. One of the things that I remind people who aren't overly concerned with China is there are two institutions, two societies on this planet that are capable of thinking long term, not just a long term memory, but long term thinking. One is the Catholic Church. The other is China society. China society, the Chinese government, about the only places that actually engage in long-term thinking and planning on any level whatsoever.
That's less true under what I somewhat affectionately refer to as the Mao Dynasty. They're much more short-term thinking, and their 5-year plans are always, okay, we didn't meet our last 5-year plan. We got to figure out how to fix that going forward. But traditionally, yes, China has been the great fact of history. I've talked a lot on recently about the general crisis theory that you look at the secular cycle that Peter Turchin has discovered, and if you look at it, the general crisis tends to hit when something happens in China, and so even back in into the Bronze Age, if China sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
Okay.
And throughout history, Chinese expansion and contraction has been a vital factor in describing what's happening in the rest of the world.
Well, I mean, yeah, their expansion eventually led to Rome's fall.
There's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that.
Quite unintentionally, it just know, we're gonna push these guys out, and they're gonna push these guys out, and then before you know it, you've got Huns in Rome.
Yep. Yeah, Adrianople is in flames. The last true Roman emperor is dead, and there's a bunch of my ancestors crossing the Danube. Yep. My ancestors would still be somewhere out in Hungary if it wasn't for China pushing the
Mongols,
the Xiongnu out and causing a chain reaction to force my ancestors to leave our old homes and cross the Danube.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that's one of the most interesting things. The way that the various histories of the world actually do interconnect much more than you would think just going through, frankly, your average public school course, where everything is presented in an extremely isolated fashion.
China had ambassadors who showed up in Rome around the time of Augustus. They refer to it as Dai Qing, or Great Qing, and they talked about how all these great walled cities that were all over, and how there were great things that they could learn, and they even invited some Romans to come over and meet with them. Before that, we've got what is known in history as the War of the Heavenly Horses, where a bunch of Greeks who had been led to India by Alexander the Great had set up the Indo-Bactrian kingdom and actually wound up going to war with China. When Marco Polo arrived in China, there were still Greek speakers living in modern China who were who had been placed in modern Afghanistan by Alexander the Great.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, the War of the Heavenly Horses. I found out about it by accident watching Time Commanders on BBC with Richard Hammond, and I was like, "This is awesome! Why don't more people know about this?"
Don't know. The Varric, he's got a question, which is, wasn't it because of Chinese retraction that the Europeans were able to colonize the Americas? I don't know the answer to this.
There is some truth to that. So we don't know. So there's this legend about a great Chinese navigator and his Red Seal treasure fleet that went out exploring. There's reports in the logs that we do have from them that they made contact with somebody out in the Pacific or maybe the west coast of the United States. But we've never been able to prove where they found what they found, where they landed, who they made contact with. And shortly after he got back, he discovered that the emperor was dead. The new emperor had no interest in any outside exploration or contact or colonization, and as a result, any potential future contact or trade with the Americas was cut off. We know that the ships of the time could make that journey. We actually know that Polynesians were probably trading up and down the entire Ring of Fire into the Americas from Polynesia, following the islands. We found what appear to be potential remnants of East Asian populations in the Americas who got swept off course by strong tides and would have crash landed in America. A very famous example happened in the 1800s when a group of Japanese fishermen actually managed to make the entire trip from Japan to California by accident when their boat got swept up in this tide. So we know it's possible that this contact was made, but we can't prove it actually happened.
That's fascinating.
But China did go into an isolationist phase shortly after this treasure fleet went out. And so any chances of them colonizing the west coast of the modern United States went out the window when that happened. It's likely they would have anyways, because the sheer amount of time it would have taken them to get across the ocean probably wasn't worth it. And they were having to deal with issues to their west anyways, with the Womb of Nations putting out another nation that they got to worry about charging in and invading them. But it's possible that they might have established trading outposts in the Americas if they hadn't gone into a closed off phase.
That is extremely interesting. Now, gosh, honestly, I think we could probably keep going for a very long time on this because it seems like you are a wealth of knowledge on the subject. But here we are about at an hour. So this is where I'm going to ask you for any particular recommendations you would have. Somebody wants to learn more about China or just anything perhaps foreign policy related. What are some books, podcasts, or just Twitter follows that you would recommend along those lines? Because Varric, I know, is a huge World War II history guy.
Oh yeah. Varric's cool. Hey Varric, nice seeing you, man. So my suggestions would be Ian Easton on Twitter. The Project 2049 Institute is his project. They did a great paper called Hostile Harbors about what an invasion of Taiwan would look like. They even go into some of the weather factors that create the constraints for when China can act. Then also, I highly recommend China Observer and China Insight on YouTube. They put out daily videos about things that are happening in China, using videos from inside, using sources from within China. NTD, New Tang Dynasty, is a great TV channel. They do a lot of talk. They have sources inside China. It is Falun Gong, so keep that in mind. They're going to have certain biases, but they've got access to what is almost a Chinese underground, because Falun Gong practitioners who are still in China are able to get messages out to them, and it's one of their primary sources. So NTD News, their China in Focus broadcast every day. It's about an hour long, and they go in depth into some of these issues. China Uncensored with Chris Chappell. It's a great sort of old school Daily Show style thing. About 15-20 minutes. They do a specific topic, and they love talking about their favorite soap opera, General Hostility, which is the internal conflicts within the CCP. It's great. And then they've got a weekly podcast called China Unscripted, where they'll bring on experts to talk more in depth. And then ADV China on YouTube is fantastic. They do a podcast about 2-3 hours weekly, where they do in-depth talk. Both of the hosts, Lauai86 and Serpent ZA, are two guys who spent time in China. They're both married to women from China. They've got a lot of experience within it. And so they talk about it from a Western perspective of somebody who's lived within China. And they talk about soft power propaganda. They talk about the Chinese military. They talk about Chinese internal politics. They talk about corruption issues. They talk about infrastructure. If you're wanting to learn about the tofu dregs construction issues with Chinese infrastructure just collapsing, they're one of the best guys to talk about, because they were both motorcycle guys who would do videos where when they were off, where they would take time off of work and they just go ride their motorcycle through a part of China that doesn't make the news. And they would capture all the infrastructure issues, the economic issues, the construction issues, and the tofu dregs. And so they've got a lot of firsthand experience within China. In fact, it was Lauai86, who was one half of that podcast, who first started pointing out some of the issues that indicated that the Wuhan virus may have come out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And but he's the one who first collated a lot of evidence that back in April of last year, or back in April of 2020 now, sitting there saying, yeah, there's something we need to look at here. This is some shady stuff. And my time in China tells me X, Y, and Z about this. So AV China and Serpent CA and Lauai86's independent YouTube channels are fantastic sources. I'm watching them every day, helping look for new things to research. And then I would highly recommend, I'm constantly recommending this, Polymatter on YouTube has a 4-part series on China's reckoning. He talks about water issues. He talks about the economy. He talks about Chinese insecurity and Chinese foreign policy issues, and why it's causing instability and may bring down the CCP. It is absolutely fantastic, especially his video on the demographic crisis. It brings it into sharp focus just how much trouble China is in from a purely demographic perspective, and why they've implemented the 3-child policy. And there's jokes now that they may be implementing a mandatory 3-child policy.
I had heard something about that. Yeah, that's kind of
Chinese netizens have been joking about how they're stocking up on contraceptives because they're worried that the government may go full Romania and ban all contraceptives because they need people.
Yeah, and I can remember a time when Romania was extremely encouraging of abortion. Like it was practically expected that you would do that instead.
Yeah.
So, and China, of course, everybody knows their 1-child policy. Very few people know that they've been slowly backing off of that for years now. I remember when
slowly and then suddenly they went from ending the 1-child policy to going to a 3-child policy within about 7 months. Because of how drastic the issue was.
It didn't take long. I remember they first started to experiment with 2 kids in like a couple of different provinces, and then before you knew it, it was policy. And now 3 children are suddenly policy. It's like, you guys don't realize you screwed yourselves.
One Child Nation on Amazon. If you get a chance, you got to watch it. It brings into stark contrast just how horrible the one-child policy actually was, and just how much lasting damage it's done, and why the little emperors are going to be a problem for China going forward,
Mm-hmm.
especially the Red Princes, because the Red aristocracy that they've created, that's going to be the worst issue that they're going to be facing.
That sounds like a good time.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I remember arguing that when I was in chat rooms when I was doing my when I was getting my own college degree, and arguing with a bunch of apparently very progressive types, why this was bad. I'm like, they're going to cause a demographic disaster with this policy. It's not going to last.
Japan is going to be the future of China that way. They've already done too much damage. It's the average Chinese is like, nah, I'm not going to have more kids. Why should I? I've got a good life. I don't want to spend time on my kids. I'm very selfish from the upbringing I've got, and they're going to be facing a very similar issue to Japan. They're about 2 decades behind where Japan is right now. And if you follow what's going on with Japan demographically, you'll get an idea of what's going to be happening to China.
It was funny. I mean, you mentioned the whole thing with the guys who just, they do the bare minimum to survive, and they play video games every time. I remember reading about that going on in China, like I probably read about that like 15 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, about that going on in Japan. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Japan is about a decade or two ahead of where China is right now in terms of the demographic crisis. And so, if you follow what's going on in Japan, you've got a pretty good prediction of what's going to happen. Demographics is destiny is a common saying outside of economics, but in economics, it is an axiom. And where you are, and so the birth rates 20 years ago is going to help define where your economic situation is now. And and so when you see a population that's shrinking the way that China is, you can look into the head 20 years and figure out what's going to happen because of that shrinkage. And Japan is China's future in that regard.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot of interesting things that we could continue to talk about, actually. Oh, yeah. But so we're just going to have you on again in the hopefully not too distant future.
Sounds good.
We'll explore maybe Taiwan a little bit more, especially as we get closer to possible,
October of this year.
We'll call it T-Day. And and yeah, I'm sure we'll be discussing all of this again. So
happy to do so.
Thank you very much for coming on and
thank you for having me on.
Sharing a lot of that. I'm sure a fraction of the vast stores of knowledge within that brain of yours. And again, we'll have you on later. And
sounds great.
Until next time, everybody, thanks for tuning in and keep